of whoever house we're traveling to go see, and we start to compare things. We start to compare our house. We start looking around going, their trim work needs some work. Or I really like their trim work. Or I really like the color scheme. I like how they have this accent wall. Or we start to compare their car, or the gifts we got, or their kids and how their kids are acting, or how their kids are maybe even misbehaving a little bit. And even as we're exchanging gifts, perhaps with our family and our friends during the holiday season, we even start to compare. They got more gifts than me. They got nicer gifts than me. If you add up all the gifts they got, they mean more, they add up to more, sum total more than I got. You see, with the holidays comes this temptation to compare. But that temptation doesn't go away when it's not the holidays. There are a lot of ways we compare, and we struggle with this every day. That even when it's not Christmas, we struggle. We're obsessed, maybe, with comparison. That we're fine with our truck until our buddy shows up with a new truck. One of those new trucks with all the bells and whistles, and it's got Apple CarPlay, and it's got 4x4, and it's got a lift kit, and it's got a wrench. Is it a wrench? The big thing on the front of it, and the big thing on the back of it, and maybe it's the fifth wheel, all that stuff. We're fine with the truck until our buddy shows up with a truck. Or we're happy with our house until we watch like the 6th episode of Fixer Upper. And suddenly, there's shiplap everywhere in our house. We're happy with what we have until we see someone else, because we're always comparing. In fact, we are never content because we're always comparing. And this desire to compare even kind of seeps over and influences our spiritual life. That we start to compare our lives and our spirituality next to our brothers and sisters in Christ. And that leads us to think things like, I've done my daily Bible reading. Look how spiritual I am. Or perhaps we think, I did my Bible lesson today, or I'm a Bible class teacher, or I'm an elder, I'm a deacon. I serve in all these capacities. I'm a more mature Christian. Look at all I've done. I'm holier than all these people because I've served and I helped that person in need. You know, it's really easy for us to fall into the comparison trap. To get so obsessed with comparing everything that it causes real issues in our life. That we always have that desire, I think, as human beings, that we want to be bigger and faster and stronger and smarter than everyone, even if that involves our kids, that we want our kids to be the star quarterback or the star musician or the star athlete or the star academic student. And that desire to compare everything creates a lot of problems. And so I want to look at 2 problems the desire to compare has, and I want to look at the one solution that Paul provides for us tonight. One of the first problems that the desire to compare everything creates for us is a desire, or really jealousy. Jealousy. You know, when we start to compare our lives and alongside everybody else, when we start to see their car or their house or their job or their clothes, sometimes we get a little jealous. That we want what they have. We walk around thinking, wow, I wish I looked like that. I wish I drove that truck. I wish I had that house. They're just so lucky. I think it's one of those things that we do all the time, and maybe we don't even recognize that we're doing it, and we're thinking it, and we're saying it. In many ways, I think we are like that kid at Christmas who's completely excited about his new Christmas toy. He's outside playing in his driveway with his new toy until his neighbor comes over with a bigger toy and a better toy. One that shoots Nerf darts at like 60 darts a second, and all of a sudden he's filled with jealousy. That's the way we are with our life. We're happy with what we have until we see somebody that has something bigger and better and smarter and faster, and then suddenly we're filled with jealousy. And we start to compare our job and our house and our truck. As we talked about a couple of months ago in our back classroom, we don't want the 19-foot boat. We want the 19.5-foot boat, right? You see, the thing about comparison is it does lead to jealousy, and that causes all sorts of problems in our life. And those problems are really exemplified when we look at social media. Now, I love social media. I use social media. I'm probably on social media more than I should be. But what they found when looking at studies of social media use is social media use can cause some real problems in our life. They found that especially with young people, increased social media use leads to anxiety and depression. And why is that? Well, these young people are compare their lives and looking out and seeing these social media influences and their friends and their family members. And they're looking on Instagram and TikTok and Snapchat and Facebook. I guess their grandmas are on Facebook. But you guys get the picture. I'm on Facebook, by the way, guys. So, grandmas and grandpas, I'm on Facebook. It's an equal opportunity offense here. And they start to go, wait a second, they've got a better car. They've got a better house. They've got nicer clothes. And they start to compare and they begin to get depressed. But that's why Proverbs 14 verse 30 begins to warn us about the problem that comparison causes. Where there in Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 30, he says, a tranquil heart is life to the body. A peaceful, your translation may say, is life to the body. That sounds pretty good. But jealousy is rottenness. I think there's one translation that says cancer to the bones. That's a pretty powerful image that Solomon uses there in Proverbs chapter 14. That peaceful heart, that tranquil heart gives life. But that jealous heart rots bones. Why does a jealous heart rot bones? We'll begin to get so consumed with jealousy. We begin to compare our lives and we get so consumed with jealousy that it destroys us from the inside out. Guys, we need to realize that jealousy is deadly. That it twists our thinking, it conforms our mind, it tortures our hearts, and it consumes our life. And we get jealous for all sorts of reasons. We get jealous and we can't stand that others are doing better. They just took another vacation, we think. They just got another promotion. They got another pay raise. Why do they always get the good things in life? And the reality is the problem of jealousy that's caused by comparison can lead to all sorts of sin in our life. And I really think jealousy is a temptation for all of us. That we get so focused on how others have been blessed that we forget how much we've been blessed. But there's no positive side to the kind of jealousy Solomon describes there in Proverbs chapter 14. That kind of jealousy that he described rots. It's cancer. It destroys. And one quick example about how jealousy destroys a relationship is Saul and David there in 1 Samuel chapter 18. By 1 Samuel chapter 18, David has killed Goliath. He's the hero of all of Israel, and everything is going good for Saul and for David. In fact, they're singing this song about David that Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. As king of Israel, you would think that Saul would be excited because David killed his foe. David killed his enemy. He provided deliverance from the Philistines. But instead, when Solomon hears this song that they're singing about Saul and David, look what it says there in verse 9. Saul watched David jealously from that day forward. That as he begins to compare what they're saying about himself and what they're saying about David, Saul is filled with jealousy. And from that day forward, there's conflict between David and Saul. What seems to be a fairly decent relationship between the two deteriorates. And to the point that Saul is chasing David around the countryside. That's what jealousy does for all of us and ends up destroying us. But the second problem, or the second comparison trap, is pride. And we see that there in Luke chapter 18. In Luke chapter 18, Jesus is telling us this parable about those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and they looked down on everyone else. Basically, they looked around at everyone else and they said, hey, I'm better than them. And that led to pride in their hearts. And so he tells this parable beginning in verse 10. And in verse 11, this Pharisee in the parable begins to pray about himself in verse 11. And he says this prayer to God. God, I thank you that I am not like other people, greedy, unrighteous, adulterers, or even this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of everything I get. You know, I think it's easy for us to look at this parable, this prayer that this Pharisee offers up and go, dude, this guy is full of himself. This guy, I would never pray like that. He is so arrogant. But you know what we've done when we say that? You know what we've done when we think that? We've compared ourselves to this Pharisee. And we've done the exact same thing the Pharisee's done. That just as a Pharisee is looking down on this tax collector just across the street, we're looking down at this Pharisee 2,000 years ago, and we are comparing ourselves, and we are filling ourselves with pride in our heart. But how many times in our life have we said something like that? Maybe it's something more along the lines of, I'm so glad it's not my kid throwing a temper tantrum in the Walmart store toy section. I keep my kids under control. If that was my kid, I'd take him behind the woodshed and I'd tar him. How many times have we maybe said something like that? Or maybe we've said something along the lines of, I would never sin like that. That sin is so horrible. Why would they do such a thing? And we don't realize that my sins and my struggles are the same as their sins and their struggles. They may take different forms, but we all have sins, and we all have struggles, and we all have temptations. So why do we say things like that? Why do we look down at the person who's struggling with their kid in the Walmart toy section? Or the person who's struggling with a specific sin? Well, because we started to compare ourselves. And in trying to compare ourselves, we started to fill ourselves with pride. We start to think things like, I'm better than that. I'm more spiritual. I am more mature than they are. After all, I'm there every time the doors are open. All of my kids are faithful to God. That's the kind of attitude. That's the kind of mentality. That's the kind of thing that the Pharisee in Luke chapter 18 would say. But what we need to realize is that's the attitude we have when we say things like that. And we give ourselves a reason to boast. Instead, what we need to have is the attitude of the tax collector there in the text. In verse 13, the tax collector, standing far off, would not even raise his eyes to heaven, but kept striking his chest, saying, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Rather than acting like this tax collector who's filled with pride, we need to have the mentality, or acting like the Pharisee who's so filled with pride, we need to act like this tax collector. We need to realize how broken we are. But the struggle for all of us, I think, is we don't recognize how broken we are. We recognize how broken everybody else is, but we don't see the flaws and the struggles and the problems that are rotting our hearts and destroying our hearts. And I think that's because when we compare ourselves to others, we have this tendency to see the best in us and the worst in everyone else. But that kind of comparison is what leads to pride in our heart. And so the question for all of us, I think, tonight is, am I more like that Pharisee? Am I more like the Pharisee in the sense that goes down and lists off the righteous things he does and says to himself, God must be lucky to have a servant like me? Or am I more like the tax collector who humbly goes before God, doesn't compare himself to anyone else, and just confesses his sin? And other times in our life when we're probably like that Pharisee. Probably times in our life more often we'd like to admit that we've acted like that Pharisee. That we look out in the world around us and all the sin and all the struggles and the people we encounter. And we say to ourselves, say in our heart, I'm so glad I obey God. But that comparison to others has led to pride in our heart. So what can we do? What can we do to avoid that comparison trap? Well, Paul tells us there in Philippians chapter 4. There in Philippians chapter 4, Paul says, I don't say this out of need, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstance I find myself. I know how to make do with a little, and I know how to make do with a lot. In all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being content, whether well-fed or hungry, whether in abundance or need. I am able to do all things through Him who strengthens me. Paul tells us there in Philippians chapter 4 that the secret to avoiding the comparison trap is contentment. That being content when things are going well, when things are going our way, when everything, all the chips are falling toward our direction, and being content when things aren't going well. Being content when we've lost our job, when we're sick, when everything is going wrong in our life. Paul understands there in the text that he needs to be content in every situation. But that's hard to do. I don't think contentment comes naturally to most of us, right? And I think that's something we struggle with, especially at the holidays. A couple of years ago, we were opening presents with Allison's family. And we're sitting around. I'm surrounded by a pile of gifts. And my 10 or 11-year-old nephew opens a gift. It's a Nerf gun. A Delta Trooper Nerf gun. I thought about putting a picture up on the screen, but I decided against it. And here I am at like 30 or 31 years old, and I see my like 11-year-old open a Nerf gun, and suddenly I'm like, I got to get my hands on this thing. Like, I am like so excited. I'm like, I look over at my wife, and I'm over here like, I got to get that. I wasn't content. Here I am surrounded on Christmas Day with more presents than I could probably count, and my mind is focused on my 12-year-old or 11-year-old nephew's Nerf gun. I wasn't content. And I think that's a struggle for all of us. That even though we have a lot of blessings in our life, we're surrounded by all the things that God has given us, we're never content because we're always comparing. But look at Philippians 4 one more time, where Paul says, I don't say this out of need, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I find myself. I know how to make do with little, and I know how to make do with a lot. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being content. I find that comforting. Because here in Philippians 4, Paul tells us that contentment didn't come naturally to him. That Paul, the Apostle Paul, the guy who wrote like half the New Testament, had to learn how to be content. And if Paul had to learn how to be content, don't you think that's something you and I are going to have to learn with too? And so that's something we need to keep in mind, that contentment does not come to us naturally. Paul did not come out of the waters of baptism and suddenly go, I am content. It's something he had to learn. And so do we. And what's interesting is Paul doesn't say these words in Philippians 4 when everything is going right for him. He doesn't say this when he's on top of the world and he's just got a promotion to a larger church and he's got money in the bank account and his retirement account's going great. Paul says this when he's in jail. Paul says this when everything is going wrong in his life. And yet, even as he sits in a jail cell, he says, I have learned to be content in everything, in every circumstance. Think about what Paul is saying there. This is a guy who's been beaten, who's been run out of town. This guy's been shipwrecked. And he still says, I can be content. I have learned to be content in every circumstance. That Paul had learned, he says in the text, to be content when his stomach is growling. But he's learned to be content when there's food on the table. Paul learned to be content when he got a new outfit. But he also learned to be content when his clothes were a little tight and a little old and the shoes were falling apart. Paul learned to be content in every circumstance. But how? How could Paul be content no matter what was going on in his life? Well, there in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 13, he tells us. He tells us how he could be content in every circumstance, and it's that verse that we love to cross-stitch on our pillows. I am able to do all things through him, through Christ who strengthens me. Through Christ, in Christ, Paul has learned to be content through feast and famine, through poverty and prosperity. Here in Philippians chapter 4, Paul tells us an important lesson. That contentment is not dependent on circumstances. Contentment comes from Christ. And I think that's something for us to remember. Because life is full of ups and downs, highs and lows. If we've lived for any length of time, we know that. That's not a surprise. And so the key for us, the trick for us, the way we make it through life, the way we find contentment is not looking at the things of this world. It's looking to Christ. That's how we, like Paul, can say, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. By simply finding our contentment in Christ. And so really we're left with a choice here tonight. That we can choose a life of contentment or a life of comparison. That life of comparison leads us to jealousy and leads us to pride. Or that life of contentment looks to the world that is not our home, but knows that it someday will be. And that leads us with the question, which one will we choose? Comparison or contentment? This world or the next? Which one have you chosen? Is this world your home, or are you looking to something else? Do you really find your contentment in your relationship with Christ? Is that enough for you? If it is, you'll find contentment. If not, why not make a change? If we can help you with that, please let us know while together we stand and sing.